In this lecture, we're looking at our second half of the Age of Enlightenment. And picking up the story where we left off in our last lecture, we said there that in the 17th century, you really see not so much an aggressive move away from religion. Men like Descartes and Francis Bacon, though they are considered to be two of the most preeminent 17th century men who launched the impulse and the culture as well as the intellectual foundations for the Enlightenment, we noticed in general that their overall outlook was actually somewhat religious. In the case of Francis Bacon, it was overtly so. And even if we know now that eventually Descartes and the implications of what he argues will be problematic for the Christian faith, it should not belie the fact in our minds that these men were attempting to live within the principles of the religion that they had grown up with. Still, though, we said that the Enlightenment really had a move away from some of the more traditional moorings or foundations for what it meant to be Christian. Again, Descartes is an emblem of this. His attempt to rationalize out what we can be certain of, and his then basing that certainty on the thinking self, on the individual person, the individual man or woman, is hardly in keeping with a more either Catholic or confessional Protestant perspective on where one finds the locus of authority that shapes their life. And so we don't want to overplay the point and make it sound as if the Enlightenment itself was part and parcel to the Reformation, or as if Christianity itself is the spark that drives the Enlightenment. We're not saying that. Rather, we're saying that in the early days of the Enlightenment, there was no yet aggressive move away from the faith. That will come in time, and in part, what we will see in this lecture is part of the unspooling or the unraveling of some of the claims of faith. You might say that the Enlightenment, based on the methods or the perspectives on intellectual thinking and on process, in the end, crowded out faith as something that could not be either empirically or rationally maintained on its own principles. Rather, the point we're making here is that these ideas, these issues of faith and reason, are not new to the Christian faith. The story of the Enlightenment and its eventual rejection of faith claims or of biblical doctrine is not based initially on a malicious move. Rather, it's based on new ideas that eventually, in a later century in particular, will form the backdrop as to why certain people end up rejecting so many of the claims of the faith. Maybe another way of putting it is, you have to want the Enlightenment principles to drive you eventually away from the faith in order to achieve those ends. The Enlightenment, in other words, has to radicalize before it becomes something that the church finds fault with. When we look down the later centuries of the church's history to the modern world, what is going to happen is, as the radical Enlightenment really gets going in the 18th century, its effects are more felt, you might say, at the popular level, at the level of the pastorate, towards the end of the 18th century and on into the 19th century. Now that's important to note because too often what is believed is that for a long period of time, really frankly, depending on what myth is in play here, you hear this constant chatter about colonial America as well as Europe and its never-ending commitment to the Christian faith that extends maybe until the late 19th or early 20th centuries. In particular, the Pilgrim Age, the colonial period, the Puritan era of the New World, is seen as overwhelmingly Christian. What we want to do here, though, is kind of muss up that picture, add some more color, you might say. From the very beginning, there are intellectual ideas and principles in play from the late 17th well into the 18th century that begin to erode a more or less Christian perspective on all kinds of things. One of the great mysteries when people begin to look at Puritan New England, for example, as we'll see in a later lecture, is that people believe that this is a benighted, simple faith age. But in fact, if we actually look at the material and the evidence of this day and age, so many of the Puritans are actually complaining that faith is beginning to erode, that people are more concerned with material comfort, with their own ideas, with their own philosophies. Now, if you just assume that everyone around them is Christian, this sounds, to use an unfortunate later word, puritanical, as if the good Christian folks around them are not good enough. Actually, what we're going to see in this lecture is that during the 18th century, flowing out of the 17th century, you do see a radicalization of the Enlightenment, and you might say a new horizon as to where these intellectual principles will go. Well, to begin with, I want to ask a question that I think is too often left unanswered when it comes to the Enlightenment. And that is, why were people so optimistic about the Enlightenment and the development of science and reason and all of these things in the latter 17th and 18th centuries? Well, we have an answer in part from a more recent scholar by the name of Thomas Kuhn. Kuhn wrote one of the books that, unfortunately, gave us some vocabulary and some grammar as to how to understand the development within science that has grown like a weed into just about every other discipline that is studied today. Thomas Kuhn wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It's a short little book. It's actually really well written. It's a good one. At this point, it probably amounts to a classic on the history of intellectual ideas, particularly when you count the fact that Kuhn's ideas here are still cited almost in jargon or slogan form, again, in so many disciplines, not just in the sciences, but in the humanities as well. Kuhn essentially attacks the idea, which so many people in the 21st century take for granted, which is the idea that science does not build upon itself like Lego blocks. It's not as if they add one fact, one nugget of knowledge, and then on top of that they add another one, etc., so on and so forth. Rather, Kuhn says that the way science develops is through what he called paradigm shifts. Now, if you've heard or used that phrase quite a lot of the modern understanding of paradigm shifting in the sense of cultural ideas and how they develop really stem from Thomas Kuhn, bringing all this together when he looked at the development of scientific revolutions. Kuhn essentially argues, in a nutshell, that you have the buildup of a body of knowledge or data. Scientists work hard at different things, they try to crack certain problems, and that at some point there becomes this pregnant moment where someone comes along and introduces a new paradigm, a new way of understanding all of the past understanding of the history of, in this case, science, and who charts a new paradigm and a new structure for how we are to understand the natural world or the sciences. Now, that's a pretty simple thesis, it's a pretty simple argument, but Kuhn makes it so effectively, and he demonstrates that at these pregnant moments, there's almost a buzz, there's an electricity that is metaphorically running through the scientific community as they are on the verge of discovering something that is, again, paradigm shifting. Well, you might say, as you get to the latter decades of the 18th century, that you have this pregnant moment really coming to bear on the European mind. Now, Kuhn talks about this in a number of different ways, but we have experienced this in the 20th century. Coming out of this age that we're discussing in this lecture, from the Age of Enlightenment, there was the Newtonian Synthesis, which we'll look at in a minute. Well, just as we get into the 20th century, a number of scholars and scientists and intellectuals are on the verge, in the very same way, of revolutionizing the way we see the material world, the way we understand physics, and all kinds of other things. In the 20th century, it's Einstein who introduces, or who is at least given credit for introducing, the new paradigm upon which so much of modern science derives its overall perspective. Now again, Einstein is not the only one. He doesn't do it on his own. Rather, by the time Einstein was beginning to write and to publish, there had been a number of problems and a number of breakthroughs in all kinds of areas that Einstein essentially puts together, and he comes up with a new understanding of gravity, relativity, and so on. And everything that flows out of the 20th century ever since. Just take nuclear fission as an example, the ability to drop atomic bombs or to make nuclear energy. These principles are based on this new paradigm shift in the 20th century. Well, to go back to the 17th century, what we have here is, again, this very pregnant moment, just at the end of the century, and just before we move into the more revolutionary or modern world as we see it emerge in the 18th century. Now, the case had been building since the 16th century. Copernicus, in 1543, in fact, in his book On the Revolution of Heavenly Spheres, had laid out what we call today the heliocentric understanding of the solar system. Stretching back to the ancient world, back to the Greco-Roman period, it was taken as ironclad that the Earth was the center of our solar system. Everything revolved around us. Well, Copernicus begins the process towards a new paradigm by suggesting what all schoolboys and schoolgirls know, which is that the sun is at the center of our solar system. Now, this is often called the Copernican Revolution, And it is. The problem is it has not yet risen to the point where we can describe it as a new paradigm, you might say, to use the phrase from Thomas Kuhn. Rather, it is beginning to build up a case. All that we had known before begins to crumble just ever so slightly once you call into doubt one of the great principles of medieval astronomy, which is that the Earth is at the center of the solar system. That old idea had been around, at least according to those in the 16th century, from the very beginning. Again, it stretched back to the Greco-Roman period. It was entirely anxiety-provoking to hear Copernicus argue, and to prove it, frankly, mathematically, and from observation, that the Earth was not the center of the solar system. It's for this reason that Galileo, the later defender of the Copernican revolution, was eventually asked to answer to the Inquisition as to the impiety of his views. It's not so much that religion itself was being used to prop up the idea of the Earth as the center of the solar system. There is frankly no verse that discusses this problem. Rather, the anxiety is very much part of European culture. And it's not just the Catholics, by the way, who raise issues of the teachings of Copernicus and others. There are plenty of Protestants who are uncomfortable with this. Well, you move into the 17th century, and you have Kepler in 1609 publish A New Astronomy, a real pivotal move in terms of the understanding of the solar system. What's going alongside this, though, is not just simply understanding that when we look up into the heavens, we need to realize that we are circling around the sun. There are also scientific and technological breakthroughs, both in terms of understanding how light works, how it reflects and refracts through glass. They now have advanced equipment to be able to look into the heavens and notice all kinds of new things and measure them in ways that they could not before. It's not that anyone in the Middle Ages was dumb per se, it's just that the ideas that they were relying upon were really only based on a little more, frankly, than the naked eye. There were some telescopes in the Middle Ages, to be sure, but the advancement from the 16th to the 17th centuries was in the area in particular of optics and our understanding of light. The old ideas had come down to us through Aristotle and Ptolemy. Both of these men had argued that the way the solar system, the way the universe works, is essentially perfect circles or perfect spheres. Planets were alleged, they were argued to be perfect spheres, and the entire solar system was said to circle around the Earth in these perfect circles. The idea here is that the heavens exhibit the perfection of mathematical precision and order. Well, the revolution in astronomy is not just simply that they believe that the sun is the center of the solar system. They also begin to challenge the idea that the solar system itself revolves around the sun in a perfect circle. Rather, we know now it's elliptical. There are all different manners of revolutions here. So just in the area of astronomy and optics, you again see this pregnant moment when you get into the 17th century. There are advancements in technology, and there are new understandings because of that technology as to how we can measure and observe the heavens. It doesn't just stop there, though. In fact, right about the year 1600 itself, just at the end of the century of Reformation, you have introduced and created for the first time the word electricity into the Latin language. What's going on here is you have a real development in the area of magnetism. An Englishman by the name of William Gilbert argued conclusively that the Earth was magnetized, and this led him to experiment on how a compass points north, which is just the first step towards a real robust understanding of how magnetism works, which is part and parcel to beginning to work out the complexities of electricity. Now, it will be not really until the 18th century that you start to see the flowering of this, but people are noticing things about the material world, about the physical world, about nature, that they had never noticed before. And it's driving not just new ideas, but new technologies, things like how a compass works and how it might be used for navigation. In the area of medicine, you have finally some real advancement in the understanding of anatomy. Vesalius, again, almost at the same time as the Copernican Revolution, in 1543, publishes his book Fabrica, in which he provides not only descriptions, but amazingly detailed illustrations of the dissection of the human anatomy. Just as with astronomy, our understanding of the human body had been locked up in a Greco-Roman understanding that had been given to us by a man by the name of Galen. And the Galenic theory was that the body more or less worked off of 4 substances. Now, these substances are known as the humors, and they are blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Now, by the 1500s, this text is centuries old. Again, it goes back to the Greco-Roman period. Well, the argument here about the body was that you had these 4 humors, these 4 substances, that whenever one got sick, whether it was with a cough or with a fever, that it was a misbalancing of these 4 substances. Now, you often hear the case that the reason why people did not dissect bodies was only because of the Christian world. Actually, that prohibition goes itself back to the pagan world. The Roman government, long before it became Christian, had outlawed dissection. And of course, Christians kept this on as well, though they certainly did so for different reasons. And it's not just simply that they viewed the body as being holy and sacred and that we are the image of God in the Christian context. It's also that, frankly, no one was going to give up a loved one for you to dissect that person. It's just not simply something they're willing to do. And often the fear, if someone died young or if they died of things like the plague or disease, the goal was to bury them as soon as possible to keep the contagion down. There is certainly some superstition about not being able to dissect or explore the human body. But you also have a lack of technology, just as in the case of astronomy, so in the case of medicine. There is just not simply the tools or the willpower or the know-how to develop anything that is different. Well, here again, in 1543, you begin to see this unravel. Someone finally provides for us a real dissection of the human body, and he takes us out of this Galenic theory of the humors conclusively and once and for all. And he argues that our bodies work essentially as an organ-based system, which is, of course, what we assume today. We have certain organs that secrete and do all kinds of different things within our body, and therefore we are a network of these different systems within our physical bodies. Again, move into the 17th century, 1628, a man by the name of William Harvey is the first to provide real conclusive, you might say diagnostic evidence of how the pulmonary and circulatory systems hang together within the body. He diagrams veins and how blood flows through it. Well, this is dramatically important because according to the Galenic theory that had ruled from the Roman period all the way through the Middle Ages down until the 17th century, essentially, when you had a misbalance of humors, let's say you had a fever, and the belief was that you had too much blood in your body, of all things. A fever is a result of too much blood. There were all kinds of ways that, according to Galen, that you were supposed to deal with this. One of the more famous ones that most people are aware of is that if you have an excess of blood, you are supposed to let out blood. You are supposed to open a vein and let a certain amount, sometimes a substantial amount of blood, flow from the body. Now, of course, everything that we know today about antibodies and about the system's ability to fight infection and disease should tell us that letting out blood is about the dumbest thing you could possibly do. You're essentially weakening the system, weakening the body, and removing much of what would drive your immune system to be able to fight these things off. So again, to go back to this Thomas Kuhn idea, by the time you get into the 17th century, and in particular when you get to the end of the 17th century, there are all kinds of reasons to believe that Europe is moving into a modern, optimistic, you might even say quasi-utopian understanding of the future. Really, it's not since the technological revolution of the more recent years, frankly, since the 1980s, really, though of course it goes back to the space race and those kinds of things in the early 20th century. But in terms of the widespread change brought about by things in this day and age, in the 17th and 18th centuries, is only matched by the more recent technological revolution. Everyone, every discipline seemingly, seem to be taking these dramatic leaps forward, and all kinds of principles and applications and understandings of the physical world, from our bodies to the heavens to mathematics to oceanic navigation, we're all beginning to explode with these new ideas and these new capacities for achieving things previously thought unachievable. Well, all of this concludes, finally, you might say, in the man of Isaac Newton. Now, Newton is not the only person to really drive the Enlightenment, but he might be seen somewhat as a hinge between the earlier Enlightenment age, when everything is very optimistic, and as we move into the 18th century, the more radical Enlightenment age that brings pretty substantial doubt, and eventually things like political revolution in the Americas and in France. The reason Newton is so important is because, in many ways, Newton himself is the man who brings together the new paradigm that will reign, frankly, from, just to give a round number, from 1800 down into the early 1900s. The Newtonian synthesis is so emphatically important for understanding everything that comes after it. In many ways, what Einstein does in his paradigm shift in the 20th century was he finally managed to solve riddles that were left by the Newtonian synthesis. And we can't go into that now, but essentially, what Newton provides here is the very bedrock foundation for understanding the physical world. Well, the dating of this paradigm shift is very easy. It's the 5th of July, 1687, when Isaac Newton published his Principia. This book, again, cannot be underestimated. It is sometimes called the synthesis or the grand synthesis of Newton. In this book, he overturns just about everything from Aristotle to the Ptolemaic understanding of the universe, but he doesn't just simply critique what has been said before. He also provides, finally, some new avenues and some new paradigms for understanding the world. It's in this book alone, for example, in this first edition at least, and on into the 18th century, of course, he does provide second and third editions of the book that expand upon his principles and his arguments. But here in the first edition, he already provides his 3 laws of motion, as well as his law or his principle of universal gravitation. This is just simply an astonishing achievement. And again, it provides the paradigm for over 200 years, right here roughly in the year 1700. But this provides the paradigm for over 200 years of how the scientific community and the intellectual community is going to understand the physical world. Based on the Newtonian synthesis, again, the ongoing developments of the study of magnets, of electricity, of developments in steam power, locomotion, and these kinds of things begin to not just simply trickle out into the culture, but they begin to explode and change everything that the world had ever known before. So to go back to Thomas Kuhn, the paradigm shift by the end of the 18th century, by the late 1700s, is so dramatic, it feels almost as if a curtain falls, and everything before it is archaic and backward and stifling. And so is it any wonder, then, that in the philosophical and the theological arenas within the church, as you move into the 18th century, you begin to see increasingly radical separations between this new scientific age of enlightenment and everything that had gone before.